Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, and thanks for attending. My name is Mona Harrington. I'm the director of CISA's National Risk Management Center, as well as the government's co-chair of... I apologize. I'm having a little bit of a computer glitch. Let me start that over. As well as the government co-chair of the Information and Communications Technology Supply Chain Risk Management, or also known as the ICT Supply Chain Risk Management Task Force. Today's webinar will focus on the task force's upcoming publication entitled Securing Small and Medium-Sized Business Supply Chains, a Resource Handbook to Reduce Information and Communication Technology Risks. For those of you who don't know about the task force, the ICT Supply Chain Risk Management Task Force is one of the primary mechanisms for government and industry to collaborate on issues and solutions related to enhancing the security and resilience of the ICT supply chain. The handbook that will be discussed today was developed by the task force's Small and Medium-Sized Businesses Working Group, which engages the small and medium business community to understand, develop, and tailor task force products to meet their specific needs. This handbook was developed to assist small and medium-sized businesses with mitigating supply chain risks, including making organizations aware of the highest priorities they could face. It was designed with IT and communications in mind. The use cases, categories, and suggested resources are relevant to small and medium-sized businesses from all sectors. However, it could be used by a variety of stakeholders. I'll stop here, as you'll hear a lot more about this product from our panelists. But before I turn the webinar over to our moderator, I wanted to take the time to thank the government and private sector professionals who developed this product. A lot of time has gone into this, so I really appreciate that, and I really believe it's a valuable resource that will reinforce our commitment to ensuring that small and medium-sized businesses in the community have access to thoughtful materials that'll help improve supply chain risk posture in the future. I'll go ahead and hand this over to John Miller, who is the task force co-chair from the IT sector. John?
Thank you, Mona, and thanks to everyone for attending this important discussion. And let me also echo your thanks to the to all the private sector and government folks who roll up their sleeves and do the work, such as the work we're going to discuss today, of the task force. My name is John Miller. I'm the Senior Vice President of Policy and General Counsel at ITI, the Information Technology Industry Council, where I lead ITI's Trust Data and Technology policy team, including all of our work globally on cybersecurity and supply chain issues. I have had the honor of serving as the co-chair of the ICT Supply Chain Risk Management Task Force on behalf of the IT sector since its inception over 3 years ago. During my day job at ITI, I represent 80 of the largest global ICT companies, many of whom participate in the task force. All of those companies work with small and medium-sized businesses, whether they're vendors, suppliers, customers, or in other capacities across their global supply chains every day. Indeed, the Small Business Administration data shows that SMB, IT, and comms providers represent more than 160,000 companies in the U.S., connecting millions of households and businesses to the internet and acquiring, building, and integrating technology solutions for themselves and their customers. So, needless to say, SMBs are an integral part of the ICT supply chain, and implementing supply chain security practices is critical for these entities who may experience supply chain risks differently than larger companies. SMBs have been participating in the task force from the beginning alongside the larger ICT companies and our government partners. But early on, we determined that we really needed a dedicated working group to focus on the unique needs and challenges facing these integral SMB players. So I'm really pleased to have the co-chairs of the Small and Medium-Sized Businesses Working Group with us today to describe the important work they've been doing and to preview their soon-to-be published report on securing small and medium-sized business ICT supply chains. I'll now turn it over to the panelists to briefly introduce themselves. Let's start with Tampa Ray.
Hey, thanks very much, John. Tampa Ray with NTCA, the Rural Broadband Association. I've been with NTCA for going on 5 years. We represent approximately 850 small, mid-sized broadband providers throughout the country. Also fortunate to be on this task force for the past 2 years, co-chairing with Ola, and this year Jeff joined us. So it's been a great experience. I've learned a lot, not only from our co-chairs, but also from the members of the working group. So as much as this product has come together, it has been a great experience and a privilege to work with everybody.
Thanks, Tamber. Let's move over to Jeff Goldthorpe next.
Thanks, John. And really, right, camera. There we go. That's me. So thank you, John and Tamber and Ola. And like Tamber, I appreciate working with the co-chairs on this working group. I am Associate Bureau Chief in the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau at the Federal Communications Commission, also the Chief Data Officer in that bureau. The FCC has been members of the ict-scrm Supply Chain Risk Management Task Force for several years now, since the beginning, and on this working group also for several years. So it's been great to contribute to the working group. The work is important, and I'm looking forward to talking with all of you today about this work product that will be released shortly by the task force. So thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. And now let's go to Ola Sage. Who is certainly last but not least. Ola has been working on the task force since its inception with me, and I believe is the longest tenured co-chair of the SMB working group. Ola.
Thanks, John. Wow, I hadn't done that math, but okay. Take your word for it. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining. I am Ola Sage, and I'm a small business founder and CEO of CyberRX. Our company is headquartered in Silver Spring, Maryland, and we, as a firm, conduct cybersecurity risk assessments for enterprises of all sizes, really, but with a focus on organizations that own, operate, or support U.S. critical infrastructure. We're also one of less than 30 CMMC third-party assessment organizations, also referred to as C3PAOs, who've been authorized by the cyber accreditation body to conduct CMMC assessment when that becomes a thing, and certify companies who support the defense industrial base. As John said, I have had the privilege of serving on the task force since its inception, and have really loved working with Tamara over the last couple of years and Jeff this year, and I'm really looking forward to participating on this webinar.
Thanks, Ola. Why don't we stick with you to provide a brief overview of the SMB product that we keep teasing folks with here. I'll leave it there. So, and you have a slide up as well.
Thanks. So I'm personally delighted, and on behalf of the co-chairs and the SMB working group, we had fabulous participants who were committed, dedicated, showing up for our meetings, contributing, working off hours. So it's my pleasure to introduce our Securing Small and Medium-Sized Business Supply Chains work product. It's a resource handbook to reduce information and communication technology risks. And this is the product of more than over a year's worth of effort by the ict-scrm SMB working group members. Our task that we set out to do was to address and identify and analyze ICT-related supply chain risks and risk management approaches of IT and communication sector SMBs with a focus on cyber risks and how those risks could impact SMBs. Our overall goal was to develop a resource that IT and comm sector SMBs could use, especially those who do not have dedicated risk management staff. And as Mona indicated at the beginning, while this was the target audience, it's absolutely relevant to organizations or SMBs in other sectors or industries, and actually to a wider range of other stakeholders. So using a variety of approaches and techniques, including research, a focus group, we did an online survey of approximately 100 or so IT SMBs. These 6 categories that you see emerged as the highest priority ICT supply chain risk categories. And these are just in alphabetical order, not necessarily weighted. Cyber expertise, executive commitment, ICT supply chain risk management, which in and of itself is interesting, single source supplier, supplier disruption, and supplier visibility. And, we were guided essentially by three key principles. We wanted whatever we developed, it needed to be simple, practical, and usable. And so the handbook features 6 fictional use cases that were designed to support IT and comms SMBs in identifying common ICT supply chain risks and incorporating ways, including ways to take actionable measures to mitigate these risks. So we'd like to show you an example. As I think John mentioned, the handbook has not yet been released, so we're giving you a preview, but we'd like to give you an example of what a use case looks like. So this is an example, and again, back to those 3 key principles: simple, practical, and usable. We wanted something that would not be take a lot of time to digest or be overly complicated, and really get to the heart of the issue right away. So there are 6 of these. Why 6? Could have been 8, could have been 12, could have been 3. We just kind of settled on 6. But our goal was to have among the 6 that we wanted to make sure we covered the 6 risk categories that we talked about. So what you'll see here is the use case scenario at the top in this case, and we had a mix of IT and comms fictional use cases. So in this case, we're talking about a rural utility service. On the left-hand side is a brief description of the use case. On the right-hand side, you'll see the risk categories that were relevant to this particular fictional use case. And in this case, it was ICT supply chain risk management and supplier visibility. Right underneath that is where we offered some potential options for an SMB to consider and addressing the risk categories that were relevant to the particular scenario. And then right below that, we added, essentially a summary cost benefit. What are the potential costs associated with implementing the options that we propose, and what are potential benefits to making these changes or engaging on some of these options. And then to the left, we added some industry and government resources for if a company wanted to do more of a deep dive or, have more context behind a particular suggestion or option. And so the whole idea is at a quick glance to be able to really get the essence of the scenario and have some actionable steps that can be taken. So all of the 6 use cases have the same look and feel, so you know exactly where to look when you're looking for what are the risk categories that are impacted by this use case scenarios. You always know the bottom right is going to be the costs and benefits. And so, again, I think we've said this a number of times, while the target audience is IT and comms, this can be used by really any organization, even large, in terms of addressing potential ICT supply chain risk categories. All right, I'll hand it back over to John.
Well, thanks, Ola. I think even looking at this one slide, we can see how this product kind of is consistent with what we've always said from the beginning are the goals of the task force. To provide proactive, actionable, useful tools for that companies out there can use. And obviously, this is tailored to ICT SMBs, but as you point out, it can be used by anyone, and I would suggest it's probably useful beyond even the SMB community as well. And again, I'll stick with you just to get the conversation started here. But before I ask the first question, we are going to try to save some time for audience questions. But if you want, you could always, I think, probably put your questions in the chat, and then we can triage them later. I just figured I would make that programming note. But Ola, I think you touched on this a little bit, but why did the SMB working group feel that ICT supply chain risk management, and really drilling down on it was so important for IT and comms SMBs specifically?
Sure. Well, I think I'll start with kind of in general. ICT affects pretty much our everyday lives, right? Everything from, facilitating data sharing, exchanging information, increasing work efficiency, even accessibility, collaboration. I mean, it just plays a huge role in our everyday lives. And one of the things I think you said it in your introduction that we learned during this process from SBA was just how many SMBs actually identify themselves as IT and comms SMBs. 160,000 companies that connect, build, and integrate technology products and solutions. And so we just felt like with the increasing challenges around ICT supply chain and the risks associated with that, our community, there's that old saying that if, a large company has a cold, small businesses have pneumonia kind of thing. So, the potential harm to SMBs could be disproportionate. And we just felt it was essential to offer some ideas and some suggestions for companies that may not have focused or dedicated risk management teams or supply chain teams to help get started and do some things that could actually, though small, have a large impact.
Yeah, thanks for that. Let me go to Tamber next. How do you think this resource handbook will be most beneficial to the IT and communications entities, kind of from a practical standpoint?
That's a really good question, John. First of all, to start out with, it's no secret that the small and mid-sized providers and IT companies are in no way exempt or at less risk of a cybersecurity or supply chain breach or attack. As Ola pointed out, it's so many out there that have interconnected devices and so many users and so many connections that it's that even small businesses are not going to be immune from it. So, the question then becomes where to start. And I know from small businesses and sometimes mid-sized businesses when it comes to cybersecurity, and especially these days, there's so many so many releases out there of resources, which is great, but there's also resources out there about, one day after another of this patch needing to be done or that patch beginning to be done or these recommendations for putting into place cybersecurity. So it can kind of seem overwhelming, I think, in many instances to some companies of where do I even start, knowing at the same time that they need to. Sometimes I think back to the old Atari basketball game, where if you're playing against the computer and you're about 6 points ahead of the computer, the only time I'm ever ahead in basketball, is you see the computer player kind of hanging out really rapidly by the basketball hoop, just sort of shaking his head really, really vociferously. And I think this can come to mind in the same way with cybersecurity, that you need to do something, but it's hard to know where. So this guide, this resource guide that we put together was intended to provide, like Ola demonstrated, some of those use cases, put the use cases together in a very short, very concise and clear manner that will be useful, that will be relatable. Also note, of course, that these use cases were drafted specifically by working group members who are small IT and comms providers themselves. So the use cases are very relevant to that kind of practice, to that size company. So they were intended to identify a real life scenario that they've encountered or that are likely to be encountered for somebody in their position, and then provide some steps as to how to approach those challenges. And then at the same time, we had the benefit of Jeff's insight as to looking into the financials. And while, as you can see, when the use case comes out, the resource guide comes out, we didn't go so far, of course, as to putting actual dollars and cents on things, but the resource guide and the use cases do offer some, insight as to idea of something that would be kind of easy, less financial undertaking to put on versus perhaps a larger undertaking, so that it can be adapted to each company's business, both their capabilities and their financial. And then lastly, I just point out that I was happy to see that right after we went to press with our resource guide, the NIST and CISA cybersecurity performance goals came out. And those do also break down the different types of approaches and a little bit of knowledge of the cost and the benefits. So nice to see we're on the right track.
Yeah, that's great. And, I'm glad that you kind of connected it to some real world policy making out there too. I mean, maybe those, I think we work with policymakers all over the globe, right? And what we see is, policymakers very rarely actually telling companies how to actually implement a requirement or a guideline or something like that. And that's one of the gaps that I think the task force is filling, even if we do see some government policymakers kind of coming along to kind of delve into some of the use cases a little bit more. So that's great. Jeff, I know you've only been, I think, a co-chair for a year, but you should be aware that the SMB working group, I think, has been one of our most prolific working groups over its history, probably. I mean, so. My question to you is how does the new handbook that's coming out fit in with the other guides that have been released by the group already to promote SMBs? What does this add guide to the existing lexicon, if you will, of similar guides that are out there already?
Thanks, John. And it's always nice to hop on a speeding train. So it's good to get on board something that's already got some good ground truth behind it. And let me jump now to try and answer your question. Let me start with the review of the work that's come before, and then I'll describe at the end how that work that we're talking about today fits in with what's come before. Back in April of last year, the Supply Chain Risk Management Task Force released what I'll call the vendor template. And that template provides a set of questions regarding an ICT provider's application of industry standards and best practices. The template can help guide supply chain risk planning in a standardized way. It provides organizations with clear reporting and vetting processes to be used when purchasing in the procurement process and when purchasing IT hardware, software, and services. And it was aimed at the broader ICT community, which includes larger providers. So it may not be well suited for smaller or medium-sized ICT providers, the types that we're dealing with in the Resource Handbook that we're talking about today. In September of last year, the SMB working group, that is this working group, released what's titled the Operationalizing the Vendor Supply Chain Risk Management Template, and it was operationalized for small and medium-sized businesses. So it was focusing that work that was done earlier in the year last year, focusing it on the needs of smaller and medium-sized businesses, ICT providers. The work, as I said, narrowed the aperture to small and medium-sized providers. It provided a product that's tailored to the needs of firms of that size, smaller providers, and it helps small and medium-sized providers apply industry standards and best practices to develop reporting and vetting processes for use when purchasing ICT hardware, software, and services to reduce supply chain risk. It includes a downloadable spreadsheet that accepts yes, no, or partial responses and to each of a number of questions that are asked for use in the procurement process. The Resource Handbook that we're talking about today it supplements this earlier work that I was just mentioning with practical guidance and resources to help small and medium-sized businesses manage supply chain risk. And it includes a set of risk categories I think have already been mentioned, and the risk categories for small and medium-sized ICT providers, and a set of practical use cases and supporting resources. It takes the earlier work that I was mentioning a moment ago, and it makes it real, so to speak, with real-world examples and resources. So the resources are provided using links. They're all open source. So so they're out there along with the use cases and a set of sort of recommendations for how small and medium businesses can apply the use cases to reduce supply chain risk. So it's what I'll call a practical guide, a handbook, tailored to the needs of small and medium-sized ICT providers. And I'll stop there.
Thanks, Jeff, for that. So, we've not surprisingly talked a lot about the term supply chain risk already throughout this, the first half of this discussion. Ola, could you kind of drill down and explain the difference between kind of more general ICT or general supply chain risk management and the focus of this handbook, which is on ICT supply chain risk management?
Yeah, so I'll start with a comment that Tamara made at the beginning, which was, I learned a lot. I think we all learned a lot. And one of the beauties of our working group is we actually did have and do have some, experts, subject matter experts in this area. And then you have folks like me who are more operational, running, are responsible for it, but not necessarily SMEs. So I guess from my perspective, when I think of just general supply chain risk management, it's like the broader, it's everything from masks, PPE to, just how to manage everyday and even exceptional risks, on a continuous kind of risk assessment process throughout the supply chain. So it's not specific to information and communication technology. I did go right back to EO 13873 to actually get the actual definition of ICT, and I thought this might be useful for our conversation. So it describes ICT as it means any hardware, software, or other product or service primarily intended to fulfill or enable the function of information or data processing, storage, retrieval, or communication by electronic means, including transmission, storage, and display. And I think, so it really is focused on the entire life cycle of hardware, software, services, and also includes entities like, third-party vendors, suppliers, service providers, end users, to the technology, everything from cell phones to cloud storage. And so to just piggyback on Jeff's point, the target audience for this particular work product was information and communications technology or ICT SMBs, and kind of looking at that perspective, or looking at it from that perspective in terms of how we manage risk. But I would welcome and invite any of the other SMBs or co-chairs who have other thoughts to offer on that. But generally, that's how I think of the difference between the two.
Well, since you invited the others to chime in, I will see if Jeff or Tamber has any comments on that. I had a thought or two I wanted to share, but let me open it up first. Okay, I don't know. I didn't see anyone chomping at the bit. So, well, first of all, I just wanted to, I'm impressed by your rattling off the Executive Order 13873 number. For those not tracking, who don't have that level of familiarity, that is the America's Supply Chains EO that the Biden administration came out with at the, really in the February 2020. No, it's February 2021, excuse me. But, the reason I mentioned that is, that was obviously while we were still, in the midst of the pandemic, right? And one of the things that was, I think, spurring that executive order was all the concerns. You mentioned like PPE and masks and things like that. And, we've had a global semiconductor shortage that was kind of exacerbated during the pandemic. And by the same token, I think we all saw and experienced on a daily basis as we were on one video conference like this after another for the better part of 2 years, how ICT and this whole space and the importance of the issue is just getting bigger and bigger and bigger, right? And that's perhaps even magnifying some of the challenges I would think that SMBs might be experiencing, because this entire ICT supply chain specifically has really and figuring out how to manage risk to it has really grown in importance. But let me get back to asking questions of others. So, Tamber, there are a lot of resources in the handbook, including a lot of government and industry standards. Again, big, huge global company. They've got a bunch of standards experts and lawyers and compliance people and others. But SMBs, they're probably saying, how do I know where to begin? Like, what am I doing with all these standards? Like, does the new guide help in that regard?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And quickly, I just want to touch back on Ola's comment previously, just sort of behind the scenes look at that very question. I cannot tell you how many times this year and then last year, Ola kept us, the entire working group, focused on exactly that. I think at the start of every single meeting, she would, okay, let's go back to slide 1. We're talking about ICT supply chain, not supply chain, and make sure we're focused on exactly that the product that we're developing is focused specifically on ICT supply chain. So absolutely kudos to Ola, and kudos to you for keeping us focused on that. It certainly is critical and a big part of what did go on behind the scenes, and a lot of thought that went into this product as well as last year's. But getting back to your question, I said, done digressing. Knowing where to start, like I said, is definitely a challenge. There's so many resources out there, and many of them are not exactly short, quick reads. But in my recommendation, I would say when this resource guide comes out, take a look at, obviously, the background that starts in the beginning with how these were developed and the particular components that went into it. But then from there, take a look at those use cases. There are only 6 of them, and they're a page or shortly more than a page each. And see which one resonates with you or with your company. That I expect at least one will. And then from that use case, look at the resources that are provided for that particular use case. Like I said, I think we mentioned earlier that the use cases do provide resources for each of the 6 risk categories that are identified. So you're pretty well covered, at least in some part, some more than others. Obviously, there are more resources for some components than others, but nevertheless, there's great resources for each of them. And most importantly, all of the resources that were in the guide were selected by working group members so that they were resources that either they use or that when they discovered them, they kind of vetted them to make sure that they would make sense in that kind of a practice. And then finally, I'd simply say that, and again, certainly starting now, just jump in at a place that makes sense for you. It's kind of consistent with the NIST cybersecurity framework, which also is tailored to allowing each company to focus on what makes sense for them, that it provides a guide, provides an overview. It's scalable so that you can jump in at the beginning, you can jump in at the middle. It's not a step 1, 2, or 3. And within this cybersecurity framework in mind, also there are a lot of funding requirements, funding grants, and proposals out there now that are requiring cybersecurity demonstration. So the NIST cybersecurity framework, the resource guide that we've come out with, hopefully those all together will give the small providers a place to start. Because even if they're not to the point of jumping in and making big changes right now, the best place to start is at the beginning and start now, so that when your company needs to implement cybersecurity practice, or when you're faced with a cybersecurity issue, or you're applying for cybersecurity, fiber, IT grants, you have these materials in place, that you have a cybersecurity risk management in place, so that you can already be in a position of moving forward more quickly, because it does take some time to look through these methods, to think through what's right for your company and what you're able to take on financially and operationally.
Thanks, Amber. Jeff, let's go back to you. Look, obviously the guide is not out yet, right? But hopefully the SMBs out there in the audience are saying, wow, I can't wait to get a hold of this guide and actually use it. Do you have any advice for how, like, a company will connect the dots once they have the guide in their hands, and how they will operationalize that, and kind of what actions they'll have to take to implement it?
Yeah, thanks, John. Let me answer your question, or try to anyway. And that is, I'll start by saying the Resource Handbook that we're talking about today was preceded by other deliverables from the CISA ict-scrm-task-force, the task force that is the working group that is produced the document that we're talking about here. And some of which I talked about earlier, some of these documents that the task force produces, I talked about them a little bit earlier. But there are others that are not focused as much on small and medium-sized ICT, on that community. And that what I would suggest is that these should be considered or kept in mind for application to firms of any size to help plan and manage the supply chain risk. And obviously they would need to be modified in light of small and medium-sized firms' size, their risk posture, and available resources. And so the goal shouldn't be to apply these earlier documents in their entirety, but rather to pick out the elements that are best suited to a firm's circumstances. And by doing that, I think it will help a small and medium-sized ICT firm make conscious choices about the components that best suit the needs of their business, given the risk posture and their available resources, as I mentioned. All of these documents and these work products are available online, are publicly available. I'm sure that the task force will be happy to make them available either in the chat or once we're finished here to those that registered, signed up for this webinar. They are, as I mentioned, they are designed more for the larger community and in some cases for larger providers, but still they're worth looking at and picking out the parts of them that would be most useful to a smaller provider. The Resource Handbook that we're talking about today provides small and medium-sized businesses with a useful jumping-off point. So small and medium-sized businesses should start to apply the Resource Handbook by understanding the risk categories in the handbook, those that we mentioned earlier. There's a relatively small number of them, and not all of them will apply with equal priority to your firm or any small and medium-sized business. So the first step should be to prioritize them, in light of your firm's supply chain risk profile. The Resource Handbook includes use cases, as we've mentioned earlier, that map to the risk categories. So there's a close mapping between the use cases and the categories, the risk categories themselves. And the use cases include options that small and medium-sized businesses can apply to manage supply chain risk. So they're practical options that are worth considering, and they're focused on the needs of a small and medium-sized business. So once the risk categories have been prioritized, the use cases should be examined, and I think that's already been mentioned. There's a small number of them, and they're meant to be practical and sort of a constructive way for small and medium-sized ICT provider to make use of, and they should be examined for applicability to your firm's environment, and then the associated options that are included with each use case, and the resources that are associated with those options can be applied to the firm's supply chain risk management plan. If there is not a direct match between what you see in the use cases and the needs of your business, the handbook itself would give you a roadmap to composing or creating your own use cases. It's not like you've got to just use the use cases that are in the handbook itself. The handbook will give you some ideas for how you can create your own use cases that might be more directly relevant to your business. And then those what you can then do is map the options and the resources to the use cases that you would develop it, or to, obviously they're already mapped to the use cases that are in the handbook itself. So as I said, the handbook will give you a roadmap for how to create them if you don't find them in the handbook already, and I would encourage you to do that. So I'll stop there, and John, hand it back over to you.
Thanks, Jeff. And there is a question in the chat very specific to something you just said, and maybe so while it's fresh, I'll just ask you this. I think I know the answer, but let me defer to you, the expert. There's a question about, you referred a couple of times to previous resources. There's a question, just what are the resources that you were referring to there, if you remember? I think it's maybe the other SMB products or SMB products or something.
That is one sort. Yeah, I mentioned those when I was speaking earlier and answering some of the questions earlier. So those I mentioned specifically. There are resources that the ict-scrm-task-force itself, the task force released all of these documents, but earlier there were resources on sort of, I'll say loosely, threat evaluation. So an examination of the supply chain threats that the broader community faces, not just small and medium-sized businesses, but larger businesses as well. I mentioned the vendor template for the broader community. That's not just focused on small and medium-sized businesses, but the larger community. And so now the way I would suggest the small and medium-sized business make use of these other resources, and there is at least one or two more that are available publicly, is to keep in mind that they were produced with the larger community in mind, so that if you're approaching this as a small and medium-sized business, there might be, in some cases, more there than you would be positioned to take on. And so the first task is just to I'll say, read over what's there, and some of these documents are rather long, but not all of them, and then to decompose them and decide what is in there that would be most relevant to your firm. And so these are not documents that are focused on small and medium-sized businesses. Those documents that the Small and Medium-Sized Business Working Group created are focused on that community. John, to answer your question, those are the documents that I had in mind, and I think later on we'll talk about some of the things that have been produced not by the task force, but by other sources that might be useful. So, John, I'll stop there and hand it back to you.
Thanks a lot. And I noticed there was also a link to the many ICT Supply Chain Risk Management Task Force resources in the chat for those who are interested as well. But and I see some other questions, but let me get to a couple of other questions for our panelists first. Ola, for an SMB that doesn't have supply chain or ICT supply chain risk management functions, or teams, or even a person, what role in the company would be best to oversee an ICT supply chain risk management function, and why?
Thanks, John. This is going to be one of those it depends answers because, in a really small firm where perhaps, the CEO or president's wearing multiple hats, it might end up being that person. It could be a direct report to the CEO or president. I think at a minimum, it just needs to be somebody who has decision-making and budget authority. I think one of the things that is an assumption in this whole conversation is that you know what your inventory is, you know what your ICT, supply chain is actually comprised of. And so I think that's really important. And so whoever has that kind of span of authority to make sure that we have kind of what is our starting point, what is it that we're trying to protect, and then making sure that that person typically has that authority. I think in some of the use cases you'll see we actually recommend using an outsource, an external consultant, because it may not just be feasible or practical to do it in-house. And so that's kind of where the depends comes in. And so I just want to underscore what Jeff said about this is a starting point for these 6 use cases. We would love to see companies create their own using these 6 categories and develop your own use cases, your own scenarios, and figuring out kind of some options. That really would give life to what the underlying intention of this whole effort was.
Thanks, Ola. That's really helpful. I know we've only got 10 minutes left. I was hoping to get to a couple other questions and then maybe 1 or 2 in the chat. Amber, how would what about the upstream providers? How do they bear responsibility, if any, to ensure that the connection to their ICT customer is secure?
Yeah, and that ties into the whole supply chain, and that's the basis for all of this. That I don't have to tell this audience that in IT and comms that the risk and challenges, as well as the solutions, don't stop or start with you or with your doors, and that's one of the perhaps largest challenges of this. So that as challenging as it may be, especially for a small company, to focus on securing what's inside your domain, you can't stop there. You have to also look at what you're connecting to or what you're purchasing. So with that in mind, as Jeff mentioned earlier, one thing that I would point to, of course, not biased at all, is the work that this working group did last year, that the operationalizing the vendor scrim template for small and mid-sized businesses is out there, and something, again, that was developed by the small, mid-sized ICT providers to identify the risks and methods of looking at and asking questions of those that you might contract with to do business. Sometimes you'll get some good information, and sometimes you won't get anything back at all. But any information is good information and can help you make perhaps educated choices as to where you want to go with purchases, or with how to integrate your network with theirs. The other place that I would mention also, with the ict-scrm-task-force, another item that they're working on is the hardware bill of materials, and I know that isn't yet quite across the finish line, but they're hard at work on it. So, yes, again, referring to Jeff's comment earlier, that if you go to the ICT Scrim website, list different products that they're working on, different things that they've done in the past, there's all kinds of things there that are absolutely focused, of course, on supply chain and ICT supply chain. So, even if there's something that isn't necessarily specifically for small, mid-sized businesses or vice versa, there's no reason to not take a look at it. And again, pull from it whatever you can to better secure the supply chain of your network. And then finally, another easy option that everybody can do is do some information sharing. resources that participate in information sharing, whether it's informal with groups that with other companies similarly situated, whether it's a formal one. I know that there's ISACs out there that have information sharing and are a great resource for becoming aware of different risks that are out there, because sometimes you can gain information about any sort of software glitches or patches that need to be made more quickly through that than it would be possible for the provider, for example, to get word out to every single customer. So the sooner that you can get the information from whatever source you have from other similar situated companies is a good thing.
Thanks, Tamber. And I'm really glad you referenced the the task force resources link, which is in the chat. And as well as you mentioned and Jeff mentioned a couple of times the ICT-SCRM vendor template, for instance. It's an important reminder that a lot of these different tools and resources that task force has developed are intended and really designed to work together. So I would really encourage folks who are interested, even if they're only interested, they think in one of the resources or tools such as this one, to explore some of the other ones, which they might also find quite useful in addressing another aspect of ICT SCRM supply chain. So Jeff, what advice do you have for SMBs that are just starting out and just kind of realizing, hey, I think I need to care about these supply chain issues? Do you recommend that they start with the handbook once it is published, or not, or should they start with something else?
Thanks, John. This has come up a little bit earlier in our discussion today, but I think that while the resource guide is a great tactical starting point for small and medium-sized businesses, I recommend that they start by with the NIST cybersecurity framework, which has been mentioned already, and the CISA cybersecurity performance goals, which I think just came out a week or two ago. So they're relatively new. They were out in draft earlier, but they were formally released more recently. Both of those resources are a great foundation. They are not focused on supply chain risk specifically, and they're not designed specifically for small and medium-sized businesses. They're designed for the community at large, but they're great foundational pieces to start with, even before picking up the Resource Handbook or the other documents or deliverables that the small and medium-sized business working group has produced. The NIST cybersecurity framework has if you go to the website for the framework, you'll find a guide, or sort of a starting guide, a startup guide that will help you sort of jump into the framework, which in some ways can be a little intimidating. It's a fairly complicated structure, but I think the startup guide that NIST provides is a useful way to become aware or knowledgeable about what the framework is. And I think, as already been mentioned, it's not the kind of thing that you have to sort of start from the preamble and work your way through to the appendix. You can jump in and start making use of the framework anywhere. It is focused on cyber risk management, not necessarily supply chain risk management, but it's a great way to start to become familiar with cyber risk in general. The cybersecurity performance goals are more like controls, more specific, and is I'll say it's a relatively short document that a small and medium-sized or smaller medium-sized business can consume. Both of those sources are a great way to start. Now, once those sources have been once you become acquainted with those sources, then it's a good time to pick up the Resource Handbook that we're talking about today And the Resource Handbook, as has been mentioned, is a sort of a more practical way of for a small and medium-sized business to design a supply chain risk management plan, and it's it does that by providing these risk I'll call them risk profiles, and maybe that's what the handbook calls them too, but starts out with these risk profiles, gets into use cases, and then a more specific guidance on what a small and medium-sized provider could do to reduce cyber supply chain risk. So it zeroes in on supply chain risk management for the small and medium-sized community, and so that's how I would go at it if I was somebody just starting out. And I wouldn't. Well, I'll stop there rather than meander, and turn it back over to you, John. Thank you.
Well, thanks, and I know we're out of time, and certainly appreciate the shout out to the importance of the NIST cybersecurity framework and the performance goals. And the good news is once the guide is published, it will include some helpful references and links to those documents as well. So folks should certainly not be shy about picking up the guide as they start their work. And learning how it fits together with those resources, I think. So we're almost out of time. The one question I will ask, especially since it was directed to Mona, and a couple of people asked it, was, Mona, when will the handbook be released? If you know, December, January, or whatnot. And I'll also turn it over to you for any closing comments as well.
Yeah, thanks, John. The plan is December, so a nice holiday gift for all. But I can't give an exact date, but we'll get there. Thanks so much for engaging us in such an informative and lively discussion about this latest SMB product. A huge thank you to Ola, Tamber, and Jeff for all your hard work leading this effort. I heard so many incredibly useful things from our conversation today, and I hope the audience did as well. Thank you all for attending. Please don't forget to visit CISA's supply chain webpage for additional information about the task force and products and resources it has developed. There are too many to list here. Thanks so much.